welcome you to Lesson 7 in your professional diploma in wine appreciation. We are nearly at the end of Module 1, and today's lesson will be your guide to tasting red wines. My name is Julia Blaine, and I am your wine appreciation educator. The objectives for today's lesson include understanding how red wine is made. We are going to talk about and describe different cap management techniques. We are going to identify principal red wine styles, and then we'll finish off with the guide to tasting red wine and a study of examples of some classic cultivars. So, how is red wine made? Maceration is the key element that defines red wine and how it's made. In a nutshell, grapes are harvested either by hand or by machine and brought to the cellar. Once at the cellar, they are processed and they are put into the desired fermentation vessel in which primary alcoholic fermentation is going to take place. During fermentation, the winemaker will monitor the process to apply certain practices and techniques to facilitate extraction from the grape skins into the fermenting juice or must. Once primary fermentation has completed, the wine will be separated from the skins by pressing, and the wine will be put into a maturation vessel where it will undergo secondary fermentation or malolactic fermentation. After a certain amount of maturation time, the wine will be bottled, and we're going to have a look at this maturation process in detail a little bit later in Module 2. The process of red wine production starts exactly the same as for white wine and rosé production. It starts in the vineyard. In previous lessons, we have discussed in detail the quantitative analysis as well as the qualitative analysis that we perform on grape juice when deciding when to harvest grapes. We will just briefly recap in this lesson. Grape samples are taken in the vineyard, and then the juice will be analyzed for the sugar content. These are the quantitative parameters. We will look at the sugar content in degrees Brix. We will look at the titratable acidity, which is measured in grams per liter, and we will also look at the pH of the juice. We know by now that we look at the relationship between these parameters when we want to decide when the grapes are ready for picking. Along with these parameters, the winemaker will also take time to walk through the vineyard and taste samples. These are examples of the qualitative parameters. So the winemaker is evaluating the phenolic ripeness of the grapes, so he's looking at the tannins and the anthocyanins. And one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that the grape quality directly influences the wine quality. When we are making white wine or rosé wine, the juice is fermented on its own. It's separated from the skins. What makes red wine red and what gives it its characteristics is the fact that the juice is fermented together with the skins. And this is why the processing techniques of the grapes at the cellar is really important, because grapes can be processed in a number of ways. Deciding on how to process the grapes before alcoholic fermentation is a really important decision that will greatly influence the resultant style of the wine. The winemaker might decide to do whole bunch fermentation. They might decide to do whole berry fermentation where the grapes are destemmed, or they might decide to do a crushed and destemmed fermentation. The winemaker may also decide to do a combination of these processing techniques into the same fermentation vessel. So let's take a closer look at what these mean. Whole bunch or crushed grapes is where the grapes are still attached to the stems. This is how wine was made essentially in the ancient times. Grape bunches were put into the fermentation vessel just as is, and they were stomped by foot to break up the berries and release some of the juice. The grapes and the stems all ferment together. For whole berry or destemmed fermentations, this is the process of removing the stems from the skins. This is done by a destemming machine, and the whole berries will then enter a fermentation vessel without the stems to ferment. The winemaker might decide to crush and destem the berries into the fermentation vessel. This is where, after removing the grapes from the stems, the grapes then pass through another machine that will crush them, breaking the skins and liberating the contents of the grapes. So during maceration and primary fermentation, 3 major phenolic compounds are extracted from the grape skins. They are tannins, anthocyanins, and certain volatile aromatic precursors. We know that phenols are important to red wine as they determine the color, aroma, taste, flavor, body, and texture of the wine. And on top of this, they also influence the wine's stability and aging potential. So just to recap, the tannins contribute towards the characteristic mouthfeel of the wine. In other words, the astringency or the dry mouth-puckering wine feel present in red wines. The anthocyanins are what give the red wines its color, and the aromatic volatile precursors in the grape skin will be liberated during fermentation, giving red wine its vast spectrum of primary aromas and flavors. The first step in deciding on how grapes will be processed, we are going to decide on the skin to juice ratio. Skin to juice ratio refers to the relationship between the amount of skins present relative to the amount of juice. In the previous lesson, we learnt about the Saunier method for rosé production and how the benefits of this method is twofold. This is achieved by bleeding 10 to 15% of the juice off of the processed grapes into a separate vessel to ferment as rosé. Not only does this method make beautiful light pink rosés, but the remaining juice and skins ferment into a very concentrated red wine because of the concentration of the phenol content. As wine grape cultivars are physiologically unique in terms of berry size and skin thickness, the choice of skin contact process will be cultivar. Because of this variation, phenols and volatile aroma precursors that are present will vary, and therefore the processing method of different cultivars will vary as well. Research has shown that skin tannins are extracted early on in the alcoholic fermentation, whereas seed tannins are extracted later on in the alcoholic fermentation. Temperature also plays a really big role in extraction of phenols and flavor. Some winemakers might do what is called a cold soak on their red grapes before an alcoholic fermentation. In cold soaking, the processed grapes or must are kept cold between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius for a certain amount of time before alcoholic fermentation starts. The cold temperature prevents yeast cells from starting the fermentation process, and it allows for a gentle extraction of color and fruit flavor from the grapes without extracting bitter tannins. After cold soaking for a certain period of time, the must is then warmed up to a temperature that facilitates alcoholic fermentation. During primary fermentation, the winemaker will apply certain manipulations to the fermenting grapes to aid in extraction of phenolics and flavor. We know that during alcoholic fermentation, carbon dioxide and heat are released as byproducts. So something interesting that happens when red wine ferments, because it's in a vessel together with the grapes and the skins, that the carbon dioxide that is formed in the fermentation will cause the solids to separate from the juice, and these solids will rise to the top of the fermentation vessel and form what is called a cap. A cap is essentially where all the good stuff is. So certain manipulations will be carried out to homogenize the cap into the fermenting juice to aid extraction. In the industry, we call these manipulations cap management. And there are 3 main things that can be done. We can do pump overs, we can do a rack and return, or we can do a punch down. So let's have a look at what these things mean. During a pump over, the juice will be drawn off from the bottom of the fermentation via a pump, and it is pumped back over the cap in order to soak it. The purpose of doing pump overs is to increase extraction of tannin and anthocyanins from the skins. This process also allows for the oxygenation of the must. The role of oxygen in wine will be discussed in detail in Module 2. And the degree of extraction from a pump over will depend on the frequency of pump overs, the duration of the pump over, as well as the intensity. Another form of cap management is a rack and return, or délestage in French. In this process, the entire liquid volume is removed from the fermentation vessel and then returned by pumping it back into the vessel over the cap. The purpose of this cap management process is to allow for extraction of anthocyanins and tannins from the skin, just like in a pump over. But in a rack and return or a délestage, we introduce a lot of oxygen into the fermentation. Once again, the degree of extraction will depend on the frequency of a délestage and the intensity of when we are pumping it back over the cap. Right, and lastly, another thing we can do for cap management during alcoholic fermentation is a punch down, also known as pigeage in French. During this process, the cap is broken up and submerged into the fermenting must. Punch downs can be done really gently by hand or by foot, or in bigger fermenting vessels, a special punch down tool can be used. This process is done manually and is very labor intensive. The purpose of a punch down is to extract, once again, anthocyanins and tannins from the cap without oxygenating the must as much as what you would do in a pump over or a rack and return. The degree of the extraction from the cap depends on which tool you are using for a pigeage. For example, if you're just punching down gently, submerging the cap and breaking it up gently with your hand, you'll get a lot more of a gentle extraction than if you're using a tool and you're really working that cap. And it also depends on the frequency of the punch down and the intensity. Cap management is a really good way to regulate the temperature as well. The temperature in the cap would normally be different to the temperature in the juice. Cap management practices can really aid in homogenization and regulation of temperature. It's also a really good way to eliminate hot spots that could occur in the fermentation vessel, and it ensures the temperatures of the fermentation doesn't rise to unfavorable highs. Temperature management is critical during alcoholic fermentation. Red wines normally ferment a little bit warmer than white wines and rosés, between 26 and 35 degrees Celsius, for increased color and tannin extraction. It is really important to note that temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius are highly unfavorable, as this greatly depresses the alcoholic fermentation. Once primary fermentation is complete, red wines normally undergo a secondary fermentation as well. The wine will be separated from the skins after primary fermentation is completed by pressing. In this process, this wine will be drained from the fermentation vessel into a holding vessel. This fraction that has been drained off freely is known as the free-run wine. All the solids that remain in the fermentation vessel we call the pomace, or the marc. The pomace is then transferred into a wine press, and the remaining wine will be pressed out. The wine that is pressed out of this pomace will be split. A portion of this wine will join the free-run fraction that is in the holding tank, and the rest will go into a separate holding tank. This is called the press wine. The reason why we separate the press wine from the free-run wine is because as the pressure in the press increases, the phenolic content of the resulting wine will increase. There comes a point in the pressing process where the phenolics are unpleasantly high, and the winemaker will decide to keep this fraction separate. The winemaker will taste the wine coming out of the press during the press cycle and make the decision of where to split the wine, or he will make a press cut, as we refer to it in the industry. We will look at press cycles and different types of wine presses a little bit later in this course. Press wine normally has more flavor, aroma, deeper color, and a lot more tannins than the free-run wine. The winemaker will decide after maturation and before bottling on the final combination of the separate components that will make up the most balanced wine. Did you know that grape pomace traditionally was used to produce pomace brandy or grappa? It can also be used as fodder or fertilizer, so nothing really goes to waste. Once the wine has been pressed off and has been put into a holding vessel, it will then undergo a secondary fermentation or malolactic fermentation. We touched on this briefly during lesson 5. We have learned that primary aromas in wine are derived from the grape itself and are liberated during the process of alcoholic fermentation to form secondary aromas. Examples of secondary aromas are sourdough, yeast, soy sauce, yogurt, cloves, cinnamon, black pepper, and even bacon. Malolactic fermentation also contributes towards the secondary aromas found in wine. Malolactic fermentation is actually driven by a family of bacteria called lactic acid bacteria. Members of this family are Unococcus uni, Pediococcus, and Lactobacillus. They all play a role in converting the harsh malic acid that you find in wine that resembles that acid that you find in a tart green apple into a softer lactic acid that you find in milk or yogurt. Malolactic fermentation, or MLF for short, occur in almost all red wines. Some examples of secondary aromas that are derived from malolactic fermentation, or MLF, are buttery aromas, hazelnut aromas, or even chocolatey aromas. Malolactic fermentation normally happens in stainless steel tanks before wine will go into a maturation vessel. A wine that has undergone MLF has a reduced total acidity, it's softer and rounder, and it's definitely more complex. Once malolactic fermentation is completed, the wine will be racked off any sediment that has formed and will be transferred into a maturation vessel. A wine's bouquet is made up of the secondary and tertiary aromas. Tertiary aromas arise from elements that will add or alter to the wine after the fermentation process, like in aging. Two important elements in the development of tertiary aromas are oxygen and oak. Wine will develop secondary and tertiary aromas during the maturation phase. When wine is put into an oak barrel to mature, the barrel will impart flavor and tannin to the wine. Along with this, oak allows for microdoses of oxygen into the wine, which will also produce a nutty character. Some examples of tertiary aromas from oak and aging are nuttiness, vanilla, caramel, clove, tobacco, and cigar box. Traditionally, red wine will age in oak barrels for 1 to 2 years, and the winemaker will taste the wines regularly and work on the composition of the final wine before deciding what will go into bottle. Tertiary aromas develop mostly with bottle aging. In red wines, this is where your red or black fruit characters will transform into dried fruits like fig or raisin, and aromas of tobacco, earth, and mushroom will develop. So now that we have covered how red wine is made in a nutshell, we are going to look at your guide to tasting red wine. The ability to distinguish between primary, secondary, and tertiary aromas is a really useful tool for industry professionals. It can aid in determining the aging potential of a wine and also in identifying the current age or maturity of a specific wine. On a practical note, it prevents wine from being left too long in cellars and passing their prime time to shine. A good way to classify styles of wine is by discussing a wine's body. This refers to the mouthfeel or the boldness of the wine, and it varies from light to medium to full. A good way to think about it is the difference in the feeling of your mouth between skim milk, whole milk, and full cream milk. When discussing certain styles in wine, we look for specific traits that contribute towards the body or the boldness of wine. Alcohol is the main contributor towards body in wine, and one can easily get an indication of whether or not the wine will be full-bodied or not depending on the alcohol content. The alcohol content of a wine influences the viscosity of the wine and thereby the mouthfeel. In a nutshell, a wine with a high alcohol content and a high viscosity will be full-bodied. Along with looking at the alcohol, other traits that can be analyzed are the color, that will vary from light to dark, the tannin content or the astringency of the wine, and then the flavor and aroma. Red fruits tend to be lighter style, and a red wine expressing more black fruits will be medium bodied, and a really full bodied red wine might display characteristics of dried fruits. Let's take a closer look of the effect of climate on the body. The boldness of red wine is directly related to climate. Normally, light-bodied wines are grown and produced in cooler areas, whereas big, bold wines are grown and made in warmer climates. What makes the vine such an incredible plant is its ability to adapt to a wide range of climates. This isn't true for all cultivars though, as some are more sensitive to others and can only grow well in cool climates. Pinot Noir is an example of this. And Cabernet Franc has a really great variety of stylistic range due to its ability to grow in varied climates. There are truly thousands of combinations and variations that can be played with when making wine. You can experiment with different combinations of cultivar, different techniques of processing the grapes. You can manipulate the specifics of the alcoholic fermentation. You can select different yeast strains. You can mature your wine in different vessels, and you can decide whether or not your wine will undergo malolactic fermentation. And lastly, you can work on different blends and combination that will make up your final product. With all these options out there, wine can be classified into three broad stylistic categories. The principal red wine style categories are light-bodied red wines, medium-bodied red wines, and full-bodied red wines. Before we look at these categories in depth, I want to let you know that in our last lesson, lesson 8, the final lesson of module 1, we are going to have champagne showers. So to get back to a red wine, let's take a look at light-bodied red wines. These wines are normally really light in color and tannin, either due to the cultivar characteristic. For example, it could be a cultivar that's got light and thin skins, or it's due to light maceration and extraction techniques applied during the winemaking. Light-bodied red wines normally have a lower alcohol content, around 12.5%, a higher acidity, and it will display characteristics of red fruit. Light-bodied red wines also pair really well with food due to their fresh acidity and fruitiness. Did you know there are at least 13 common red wine cultivars? Can you guess any? Let's take a look at medium-bodied red wines. As the name suggests, these wines display a good balance between tannin, alcohol, flavor, and aroma. Tannins can be expected to be more than those found in light-bodied red wines, but not nearly as astringent as in full-bodied reds. Expect a moderate acidity and an aroma that is predominantly red fruits. In this stylistic classification, the intensity of the body of the wine is mostly influenced by winemaking practices like maceration and cap management for extraction. Medium-bodied wines have an alcohol content between 12.5 and 13.5%, and these wines are normally great food wines. Full-bodied red wines have an undeniable presence on the palate. Expect big, bold tannins and a dark, rich color. They are normally made from grape cultivars with thick skins and winemaking techniques that focus on maximum extraction. Besides a high skin-to-juice ratio, the seeds of the grape are also a source of tannins, which are extracted during alcoholic fermentation. Full-bodied red wines tend to have an alcohol content of about 13.5% or higher. This higher alcohol also adds to the viscosity of the wine, which makes it feel fuller and richer. These wines often have a touch of residual sugar, only around 3 grams per liter, and this will also add to the viscosity of the wine and therefore the mouthfeel. Besides the grape cultivar characteristics and the specifics of alcoholic fermentation, there are a few other factors that will influence the body of a wine. Malolactic fermentation is one of these. A wine that has undergone malolactic fermentation, just to recap, this is where malic acid is converted into lactic acid and it is driven by a bacteria. This will result in a wine that has a rounder, creamier mouthfeel and it adds to the fullness. The use of oak adds tannins as well as aroma compounds to a wine, which adds to the body and brings balance to the wine. Generally, big and bold wines will have been aged in oak for 1 year or more, and the newer the oak vessel, the more it will influence the wine. Flavors and aromas of light-bodied wines lean more towards red fruit, whereas flavors and aromas of full-bodied wines lean more towards black fruit. Flavors and aromas of light-bodied red wines will lean more towards the realm of red fruit, whereas flavors and aromas of fuller-bodied red wines will lean more towards the realm of black fruits. Some examples of red fruit characteristics that can be found in red wines are cherry, strawberry, red currants, cranberry, and pomegranate. Cultivars that display characteristics of red fruit are your cultivars like Pinot Noir, Grenache Noir, and Merlot. These wines normally fall in the light to medium body style categories. Examples of black fruit characteristics that can be found in red wine are black currant, blackberry, blueberry, fig, and black plum. Grape cultivars that tend to display characteristics of black fruits are Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, and Malbec, for example. The ability to differentiate between black fruits and red fruits will be a useful tool in blind tastings, for example, as it is always a good way to learn to start identify cultivars through sensorial evaluation. As a general rule of thumb, as we said, light-bodied wines express flavors and aromas in the realm of red fruits, and in the fuller body wines, you're going to expect more black fruits. We have touched on what wine color means in previous lessons, so just to recap, when we are doing a sensorial analysis on wine, the first step is to look. By looking at the color of the wine and evaluating the shade, hue, and opacity of the wine, we're already beginning to gather information on the wine. We know that red wine gets its color from anthocyanins, which are compounds that are located in the skin of the grape, and this color is extracted during maceration, and it binds to tannins and forms a stable pigment at wine pH. Learning about the color of red wine can also be a very useful tool when identifying wines in a blind tasting. When evaluating color, the intensity of the color can tell you if the wine is light-bodied or full-bodied. A very intense color also hints towards a wine with a high tannin content. Color can be very useful in identifying how old the wine is, because as wine ages, the tannins and the anthocyanins bind to each other and they eventually precipitate, leading to a loss of color intensity and the development of a brick red color. Let's have a look at some classic cultivars. A really great example here is Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is known across the globe, mostly in cooler climates. The grape is mainly associated with the Burgundy region in France. Pinot Noir is used to make red wines, and it's also one of the principal varieties used in sparkling wines in Champagne. Pinot Noir is a thin-skinned grape variety, and it is very finicky to grow. It is a cultivar that is very sensitive to temperature extremes and rot. The thin skins of Pinot Noir and the low tannin content is what gives Pinot Noir its typical lighter color. Pinot Noirs have an alcohol content that varies between 12% and 15%. When Pinot Noir is made well, it can be one of the most complex and captivating wine. When we look at the color of Pinot Noir, we can expect a light crimson to a pale ruby. Once again, this is due to the thin skins of Pinot Noir along with the very low tannin content. The flavor and aroma profile of Pinot Noir is very dependent on the climate. Pinot Noir that is made in a cooler climate will make wines that show more red fruit, whereas Pinot Noir that is grown in warmer climates also shows signs of red fruit, but will have some earthy notes to it as well. When Pinot Noir has been aged in oak barrels, we can get some hints of vanilla and spice. Due to the bright acidity and spectrum of red fruits and earthy flavors found in Pinot Noir wines, Pinot Noir is a great food wine. Think about duck breast, mushroom risotto, or pork. When serving Pinot Pinot Noir, we can serve it slightly chilled between 12 and 15 degrees Celsius. Use an aroma collector glass so that we can really gather all of those lovely, delicate aromas of a light-bodied Pinot Noir. And Pinot Noir wines will benefit from decanting between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. As we get to the end of Module 1, I wanted to take some time to remind you about your learning path with Shaw Academy. No matter why you decided to sign up for this course, we strive to teach practical skills for everyone. Whether you are a hobbyist looking to find courses for every level of learning, or a professional looking for a crafted learning experience. Or perhaps you are an entrepreneur looking to build confidence in multiple areas. Whoever you are, we here at Shaw Academy have a course for you. Don't forget that coming up next week is Lesson 1 of Module 2. Remember to book your spot now to avoid disappointment. We have many membership options available, and there will definitely be one that suits you. Did you know that Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc are all from the same family of Pinot Noir? They are just color mutations. A good example of medium-bodied red wine is Merlot. Let's take a closer look at this cultivar. Merlot is the most widely planted grape cultivar in Bordeaux, France. The adaptability of Merlot to grow in different types of climates is what makes this grape one of the most popular varieties. Merlot grapes are soft and fleshy, and it's made in two main styles. The international style is commonly found in New World areas such as the United States. Merlot grapes intended for this style are harvested later and therefore riper. They will be more full-bodied and they will have a higher alcohol. Compared to the traditional style, which we will be using as this example, it is more medium-bodied. This is how it's made in Bordeaux, France. The grapes are harvested a little bit earlier in order to maintain acidity. They have moderate alcohol levels and soft tannins. These wines are medium-bodied with lots of red fruit. The alcohol will vary between 12% and 15%, and these wines are normally oaked for approximately 1 year. When looking at the color of Merlot, you can expect a deep ruby red, and classic aromas and flavors that can be found in Merlot are once again dependent on the climate and the intended style. Merlot displays loads of red fruits as well as black fruit characteristics such as black cherry, raspberry, and plum. With oak aging, it can express notes of tobacco, vanilla, and mocha. Merlot matches with a variety of foods because of its medium body and acidity and soft tannin structure. It pairs well with lighter meat like chicken and roast vegetables or ratatouille, as well as lean cuts of beef. If the Merlot has been made more in the international style or the New World style, which means it's fuller bodied and has a higher alcohol, it will pair well with richer foods. A good temperature to serve Merlot is between 12 and 15 degrees. Use a Bordeaux-shaped glass or an oversized glass to really enjoy all of those aromas that Merlot presents, and it can benefit from decanting between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. Remember, all the summary notes and slides are available in your toolkit, and it will be really worthwhile to keep as a resource at your fingertips beyond this course. But no sneak peeks. The lesson notes will only become available after you have attended your class or caught up with your lessons. These will also help you prepare for your first assignment. Did you know that Merlot is one of the 5 primary grapes in the classic Bordeaux blends? Do you know the others? When we are looking at a good example for a full-bodied red wine, we can use Syrah. Did you know that Syrah and Shiraz are the exact same grape? Syrah is primarily grown for red wine production, but it makes really great rosés as well. And a prime example of an area that grows beautiful Syrah is the Rhone Valley in France. Syrah is a very dark-skinned grape, and the flavor and aroma profile that it will display is very climate dependent. Wine made from Syrah grapes that are grown in cooler climates, such as in the northern Rhone Valley in France, tend to be medium-bodied with medium tannins. But wine made from Syrah grapes in a warmer climate, like the Barossa Valley in Australia, will be full-bodied with big tannins. The tannin structure and acidity of Syrah wines allow for great aging potential. Because Syrah has got really thick skins and high levels of tannins, winemakers will often perform a cold soak to this cultivar to allow for a deep color development and a gentle extraction of flavor. The alcohol content of a Syrah is normally between 13.5 and 15%. Syrah can make some of the darkest red wines. You can expect colors from medium to dark purple. The aroma and flavor is once again climate dependent. In a cooler climate, you can expect notes of blackberry, mint, and black pepper, whereas in a warmer climate, we can expect more jammy fruits, notes of spice, licorice, anise, and leather. When Syrah has been aged in oak, we can also expect hints of vanilla and spice. Bold wines call for bold foods. When drinking Syrah that's full-bodied, think about barbecued meats with smoky flavors or ripe and rich cheeses, and it goes beautifully with lamb. Syrah can be served between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius in a standard or universal red wine glass. Syrah will benefit from decanting for 45 minutes to 1 hour, but remember to taste your wine when you are decanting periodically, and then you can decide when would be the right time to serve it. It has been said that a meal without wine is like a day without sunshine. So I challenge you to use our specially designed flavor and aroma wheel for red wines while tasting wine and enjoying it with food, and tell us about your experience in pictures or in words. #SureWine. The 5 practical skills that we will develop in the wine appreciation course includes tasting wines, navigating the bottle, careers and terminology, as well as wine service, primary fermentation, secondary fermentation, and viticulture, which falls under viticulture and enology, wine styles and wine cultivars, as well as wines of the world. Congratulations on embarking on this journey, and have a look at the skills you have acquired so far. This is just the tip of the iceberg, as in wine, one never stops learning. We will continue to check in on you and your progression during this course. Well done, keep it up. Cheers.